This comment is in response to a video about how psychosis can diminish your speech and imagination and memory. And while lobotomy can do those things, it is no laughing matter. The history of psychiatry is dark and tragic, and there weren't really effective treatments for psychosis before antipsychotics came along. I mean, there were treatments, it's just that they weren't incredibly humane, and lobotomy was one of them. Lobotomy came about in the mid-20th century, and antipsychotics weren't really a thing until the 1950s. So before then, this, along with other treatments like insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy, were the standard. And they weren't very safe, and they caused a lot of harm to patients. For instance, insulin shock therapy was a type of therapy in which patients were put into insulin-induced comas on a daily basis. And this caused convulsions, and this caused drooling, this caused like cognitive deficits. Electroconvulsive therapy is still used today, but it's not done the same way it was back then. Back then it was used without anesthesia, which was incredibly painful. And lobotomy was along the lines of this same kind of treatment. It was inhumane, it was harmful, it caused more harm than good to the patients who had it. Some of the consequences of lobotomies were developing epilepsy, seizures were very common, people developed incontinence, a lot of people had permanent cognitive impairments. You know, they would lose their intellectual ability, they would lose their personality, they would be reverted to like a childlike state of demeanor, and they would have little inhibition, little self-control, little self-awareness. They might not even be able to identify themselves in others because they lose that cognitive ability. It caused a lot of harm, and for a lot of people this resulted in permanent incapacitation and lifelong institutionalization. The hope was that it would reduce the complexity of psychic life. So basically it would make life more tolerable with a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, but it would be at the expense of the patient. It would put the patient into a surgically induced childhood where they would have a very infantile personality, and this would make them a lot more tolerable to everyone around them, but they themselves would still be living with this disorder. It may have some improvement, but in most cases it did not. Fast forward to today, when we have antipsychotic medication and this is no longer practiced. Insulin shock therapy is no longer practiced. Electroconvulsive therapy is still practiced, but it is done so humanely today with anesthesia. It's a much different time to be psychiatrically disabled. It's a much better time to have treatments that, while still may have consequences that are unfavorable, are far less extreme than the experimental phase of psychiatry from the mid-20th century.